Well, welcome everyone. I'm Susan Anholt. I am a member of the Ecumenical Planning Committee and an Anglican priest. And I want to welcome everyone for joining us for our final session of Signs of Life in the Local Church series. I wish to make the land acknowledgement. And as we gather here today, I acknowledge that I am on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis people. And we pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship to one another. And today we especially uphold the First Nations people and all Canadians in our prayers as all come to terms with the truth of the history of the residential schools. And I would invite Cheryl Toth as chair of the Ecumenical Planning Committee and Anglican priest to offer opening prayers.
Thank you, Susan. Let's take a moment to pray together as we begin. Loving and gracious God, we thank you that you gather us together. You gather us together through this technology, but even more deeply and profoundly, you gather us together through your Spirit. Enable us today, as we listen to one another and to Robin, our speaker, to hear you speaking to us through him and through one another in ways that will encourage us in our local places of gathering and in the areas of ministry to which we are called. Enable us, O Lord, to hear you in our midst and to know your presence. For you are both beyond us, beside us, and within us. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. So today we're joined by the Reverend Dr. Robin Haensel, and Robin serves as the Director of Church Development for the Canadian Midwest District of the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church in Canada. He's a graduate of the Doctor of Ministry program through Lutheran Theological Seminary in Saskatoon, and his D.Min project addressed spiritual care in underserviced areas and considering how to equip the church to serve those often ignored because of the logistical challenges of shrinking rural population. So without any further ado, Robin, if you would just take it away.
Thank you, Susan. I'm going to try to share my screen here, I hope. And we'll go to there. Is everybody able to see my screen?
Not yet.
No, we can't see it yet, Robin.
Okay, I guess I haven't actually shared it yet, have I? Where am I? There we go. Let me do this. There. All right.
That's it. Perfect.
There we go. Technology. I'm the wrong age for the technology. All right. Well, I want to launch in. I have a lot of stuff here. I'm hoping that I can get through. I'm going to try to keep my eye on the time and try not to tell too many stories. But as Susan mentioned, I did my doctorate of ministry on spiritual care in sparsely populated regions, underserved areas, and we're going to dig into that a little bit today. Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, he said, neither do we go beyond our limits by boasting of work done by others. Our hope is that as your faith continues to grow, our sphere of activity among you will greatly expand so that we can preach the gospel in the regions beyond you. For we do not want to boast about work already done in someone else's territory. In many ways, this is not an accurate picture of what's gone on in Western Canada over the last 100 years, and yet there are some similarities, because we could legitimately say that particularly in Western Canada, while there are no places beyond the reach of the gospel message, utilizing all of the technologies of which we're participating in today, some of them, but the essence of the Great Commission that Jesus gave to his disciples in Matthew 28 was not just simply to get the message out, but to make disciples. And the challenge is that while technology can get the message out, it's much more difficult to make disciples using technology than it is one-on-one. You know, Jesus, in fact, said, you know, come follow me, come be with me, hang out with me, watch what I do. And this is the essence, I believe, of disciple making, and something that rural churches in particular are well known for and do well. Paul was challenging his readers at this point really to allow he and his team to be risk takers and adventurers, but also calling them to be risk takers and adventurers. And he's calling us to that same thing, I believe. And the question is, are we up to the challenge? So the question that I ask when I read that passage and when I think about my role is, where are our regions beyond? Where are those places that that are out of the view, if you will, of other groups and other individuals and other people? We, in our denomination, we often talk about least reached people, but least reached people that are within our sight, within our sphere of influence, within our potential sphere of influence. Where are these people and who are they for us in our region, in our district? A number of years ago, we reflected on that as a group, and we determined there were three such groups within our borders: the First Nations people, new immigrants, and people in sparsely populated regions. As with all of you, my heart was broken when we heard the news of the residential school in Kamloops. And we had our district conference a couple of days ago, and we had the privilege, I think I can say the privilege of having one of our First Nations pastors speak to us at the start of that district conference, just about the impact of that news. And I know I'm not alone when we talk about the deep pain that we experience for our brothers, for our sisters. It's a worthy conversation to talk about the First Nations and people that are new immigrants. And I don't want to suggest in any way that they're not as important as what I'm going to talk about today, but my focus today is people in sparsely populated regions. And sometimes that includes First Nations and new immigrants. I think if COVID has taught us anything, it is to think beyond our historical normal. Every challenge that the church has faced over its history has caused it to adjust. I wish I had time to show a humorous video that's related to the introduction of the book, the bound book with its pages, its cover and all of those things. But when the book came, it revolutionized the way the church communicated. It didn't continue to use scrolls. They adapted, they adopted the book, and they used it to their advantage. And we need to consider how what we have learned, particularly over the last 15 months, can position us to help the church as a whole make our greatest impact for God's glory. And that's especially true, I believe, of those in sparsely populated regions that continue to lose people to large urban centers. I'm not sure if you are familiar with the West Country and Western group, Prairie Oyster or whatever they are. I'm not sure if they're even Country and Western, but they did a song a number of years ago called One Way Track. And I heard this song a few days ago, but kind of almost, I would say, for the first time. I heard it with different ears, with a different perspective. The first stanza says, Billy was born in a prairie storm. Dust turned the whole town black. Dad left home a month before and promised he'd be back. He said, I can't make a living out of farming dust. Ain't no other job around here. This was obviously written about the 30s and the incredible drought. But they go on to say, then he turned and climbed aboard the train as she fought back the tears. Every train that leaves a prairie town is running on a one-way track. And I think if you've heard that song, if you remember it at all, or if you maybe Google it and listen to it this afternoon after the presentation, you'll hear the powerful, negative hopelessness in those words of that last couple of lines. Every train that leaves a prairie town is running on a one-way track. In other words, you leave, you never come back. And that's the essence of that song. The inevitability can be, and I believe it has been, a crushing blow to many rural people and many rural communities over the last 90 years. Back in the 60s and 70s, when I was going to school, there were 2 school buses with a combined capacity of over 80 people that brought students from the community of Lacadina, from that area, to Elrose School, where I attended. And my doctor of ministry was about the Lacadina area. That farming community is situated in such a way as to have their students from that one community bused to 3 different schools. Some would come to Elrose, some would go to Eston, and some would go to Kyle. The entire student population at the School of Elrose now is just beyond 80. And so the number of students that came from Lacadina in the 60s and 70s, excuse me, now constitutes almost the entire school population of Elrose. And that tells you what has happened to our rural communities. This is a picture of Lacadina in 1965, and you can see the businesses here along Main Street. You can see all of the community houses, the homes there. There's the United Church up in the center. Those of you with prairie roots will know that this was a staple of every small community back in those days. The stockyard pens, just as common as the elevators were. They disappeared in the early 60s, but that was what it looked like in 1956. Fast forward to 1980, and you'll see that this whole area in here that was filled with houses and businesses is completely empty. If you look up here, lots of houses gone. The whole community has been decimated. A huge difference in the number of homes and the number of businesses. About 95 years ago, Dr. E.H. Oliver, who was the principal of St. Andrew's College, made this statement referring to the many settlers that were moving west. He said, neglected, these Canadians contribute towards the paganizing, excuse me, I'm going to have to move my pictures over. These Canadians will contribute toward the paganizing of our country and will themselves suffer moral shipwreck. And I wonder if a voice will rise up against us. I was a stranger and you did not visit me. I was a lonely settler and you said to me, I will make profits out of your wheat, but I will let you eat out your soul in the desolation of the frontier. I will not come to you, nor send a messenger of the word. I believe that these words from Dr. Oliver continue to be a challenge for the church. And how will we respond? This is a graph of the portion of the population living in rural areas in Canada from 1851 to 2011. And you can see that steady decline. And Tim Beadle, interestingly enough, a couple of weeks ago, referred to the urbanization of the world in general. Here we see how this has impacted Canada. We lost our rural majority between 1920 and 1930. And certainly part of that was due to the many farmers in Western Canada that gave up during the Dust Bowl era of the 30s. And by the early 2000s, you can see that we had dropped to just over 20% rural. An incredible shift from 150 years earlier when the rural population made up 85% of our country. This blew my mind when I was doing my research. I was quite intrigued to realize that the 4 most rural provinces, according to Statistics Canada, are the Maritime Provinces. The 3 territories are slightly more rural than Saskatchewan, which actually ends up being the 5th most rural province. I differentiate between rural and sparsely populated and isolated communities in my doctoral work. But if you look at the territories, though they are, if you look at their entire land mass and the population, they seem to be very sparsely populated, yet all of their population, for the most part, their population is gathered in communities of the largest being 21,000 in Whitehorse to around 1,000 in Kugluktuk in Nunavut. So these are communities that are isolated, but the people in them are not necessarily sparsely populated regions. Statistics Canada and the government of Canada a number of years ago said that for a region to be considered rural, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, population density must top out at 150 people per square kilometer. That's a lot of people. I mean, most of us that work in rural areas of our provinces realize that most of them don't have that. In fact, the area that I did my research in, the RM of Lacadina, the rural municipality of Lacadina, the population density there was less than 1 person per square kilometer. You don't have to look very far to realize that there's quite a difference between Western Canadian prairie rural and many other areas that are classified as rural. Rural Ontario, rural New York State are not the same as rural Saskatchewan. Sparsely populated regions, in my definition, are an area that have less than 1 person per square kilometer and have no community larger than 5,000 people within a 30-kilometer radius. And there are a lot of those communities in our province and in in Manitoba and Alberta as well. As I did my reading, I discovered that there are a lot of different definitions, a lot of different kinds of rural. There's remote rural, there's industry-based rural, shrinking rural, country rural, cornfield rural, metro satellite rural, resource-based, county seat, suburban fringe, smaller sibling, small town, migrant, resort, solo, non-church, corridor, and playground. And all of these would have a different culture and a different way to reach them. Think about your setting. Where would you fit in these 17 different types of rural? What would yours be? I've got a couple of questions, 3 questions here that I would like you to just reflect on. We're not going to discuss them, but I'd like you to reflect on them as we continue through the presentation and even beyond. And I'll be more than happy to make this PowerPoint available to you as well. But when you consider your ministry location or your locations, would you describe them as rural or as sparsely populated? If your location is rural, what kind of rural, what type would you say best describes it? And how might that affect your method or your style of ministry? If your location is in a sparsely populated region, how do you stay connected to your flock? Because it's a long drive from one neighborhood to the next. Much of my awareness, much of my understanding of rural and sparsely populated regions comes from my own personal experience growing up in a small community and being reasonably connected with our local United Church at that time. So my experience of multi-point charges is that they were a cost-effective way for very small communities to retain some degree of connection and even autonomy as populations shrank. They had their own minister, although they weren't exclusive, as you all are well aware. And so our United Church minister lived in Elrose. They traveled initially to Green and Wartime, Houghton and Forgan to have services. Not every church had a service every week. There were usually 3 services on a Sunday. By the 70s, in that pastoral charge, Elrose and Wartime were the only churches that were still meeting in their own communities on Sundays, and everyone else traveled to one of those 2 communities to attend worship services. At the same time, there was a pastoral charge in Kyle White Bear, and that included Kyle, Lacadina, and White Bear. Kyle has since amalgamated with Elrose, and there are only services in Kyle and Elrose, with the minister living in Eston. His wife served in that United Church there, and some of you will know the McNaughtons. And recently Jim retired. I'm unaware of the congregation's plans for future ministry, pardon me. But as you can see, and as you know from personal experience, many of these multi-point charges are now either without clergy or they're closed altogether. And I refer to the Elrose situation because that was my experience. That's my history as I grew up. The reality is these struggles are not confined to 1 or 2 denominations. we are wrestling through exactly the same issues in the Alliance in Western Canada right now. When do we help churches figure out a new path forward? So I'm going to put up some discussion questions, and I'm going to give you the 7 minutes here. Briefly share your story with others in your group, and it will have to be brief, regarding your personal history related to where you came from, where you've served, where you currently serve. And as you tell the story and as you listen to the other stories, pay attention to the multi-point charge experiences and the church closures. Think about what emotions you and others might have experienced when you became either part of a multi-point charge or when you experienced the closure of a local church. All right, I will continue on, I think, except I can't seem to, for some reason, I can't seem to advance my slides. Oh, there we go. Is there another way? Is there a different way that we can do this? And I think we all know that there has to be. We've got to figure something out. A couple of people that Cam Harder quotes in his book, Discovering the Other, which if you have not read, I highly recommend. Cooper Ryder and Srivastava suggest that organizations change in the direction of their most frequently asked questions. That's an interesting thought, an interesting statement that I've been mulling over for the last several weeks. The reality is then, so if all of the questions that we ask are focused on survival, we're going to go into survival mode. Questions that can accentuate the positive and the hopeful can move churches toward a more hopeful and positive future. And so I think those are the things that we need to be thinking about as we lead and as we try to encourage. In the time that we have remaining, I want us to begin thinking about two concepts, the concept that Cam Harder talks about in Discovering the Other, and another one that I came across in a leadership class that I did many years ago, entitled Collaborating with the Enemy by another Canadian author named Adam Kahane. Both of them use some similar concepts, though they're titled differently. They talk about defining, choosing the focus, discovering, appreciating what is, dreaming, imagining what might be, designing, determining what should be, and then delivering, creating what will be. And so I want to dive into Kahane's process of collaborating with the enemy and just talk about that for a couple of minutes. And I'm going to just skim the surface of what Kahane has done in his work. But I highly recommend this book, Collaborating with the Enemy. When we look at a problematic situation and we look at something like delivering spiritual care in sparsely populated regions, the question we ask is, can we change the situation? If the answer is yes, or the answer is no, there are obviously two streams. If the answer is yes, can we change it unilaterally? Can we make a decision that will make it so? Or can we bear the situation as it is? Again, two opportunities, yes or no. If we can cause the change unilaterally, if we can't cause the change unilaterally, we have to collaborate. We have to pull a group of people together and figure out what we're going to do. If we can affect the change unilaterally, we do so and we force it. And I think if you were to ask many people from rural communities, sparsely populated regions, they would say that is the tack that most denominations have taken. They haven't had a collaborative process of working through what are we going to do. The denomination has said, and I know I speak as someone who is part of a denominational leadership. We have tried to communicate and collaborate a little bit, but ultimately we make this decision and we say, no, we're just going to close the church. If we can bear the situation, we can either adapt or we can exit. And I fear that as many times people feel like the denominational judicatories have forced a decision, their response is to exit. And many of them leave the church because there is no church in their community and they don't look for a church somewhere else. Qu'Appelle says there are actually 5 ways to deal with problematic situations, all of the ones that we've already looked at. And then when he begins to talk about collaborating with the enemy, can we control the change? Can we affect it unilaterally? No, we can't. Can we control the change? If we can, then we go into conventional collaboration. If we can't, we go into what he calls stretch collaboration. You can see the difference in the images, and that is similar to the reality of the challenge of those 2 types of collaboration. Conventional collaboration, you bring everybody around the table and you figure out a way through it. Stretch collaboration, you're all kind of in different lifeboats, but you know you want to get to the same end goal or a similar end goal. And so he talks about how that actually happens and what's the process for stretch collaboration. So again, I want to talk about the 2 approaches, how we relate to with our collaborators. In conventional collaboration, we focus on the good. We focus on the harmonious team, the superior one whole. In stretch collaboration, we actually embrace the conflict, the connection, and the conversation. We realize that we come at things from a different perspective, and we are also multiple diverse hold-ons. In other words, we are one, each group, each collaborator in a sense is a whole in and of themselves, but we realize that we are better together. And so we try to function in that regard. In conventional collaboration, we advance our work by agreeing on the problem, and then we agree on the solution. There's one optimum plan, and we all agree on that and begin to move forward. In stretch collaboration, we actually develop multiple possibilities of goal, and then we experiment our way forward. I'm going to try to help you understand this a little bit better. How we participate in conventional collaboration, we change what other people are doing, or they change what we are doing. There's one paramount leader who guides the process. In stretch collaboration, we all step into the game. We're multiple co-creators. Together, we begin to fashion something. And at the end of it, it likely doesn't look like anything that any of us would have thought of on our own. This is I love this image. In conventional collaboration, we sit around the table and we make it happen. In stretch collaboration, we begin to flex and move and watch and pay attention to how the other person is moving, and we try to create something together that's new and unique. Adam Qu'Appelle was a chemical engineer. By training, that's what he was. And so he came to the point when he was surprised by a notion that there was not simply one correct answer. All of his training taught him to look for the answer, for what's the right way to do things. And I expect your experience may be like mine. When I insist on the one correct answer, which usually is my answer because I always come up with the best one, it causes more conflict than collaboration. And so once I acknowledge that I don't have the correct answer, I can actually begin to listen to that other person's thoughts. I can listen to their perspective. I love Qu'Appelle quote, a quote in Qu'Appelle's first book, in the introduction. He says, "We have learned we talk by telling and we listen by not listening." Such a true reality for us. I talk to convince you that I'm right, and I listen to you simply in order to gain ammunition, if you will, to rebut your statement. We don't actually listen for merit. We listen to try to convince you of our way of thinking. When I was taking my Doctor of Ministry, I took a class called Preparing for Ecumenical Ministry, and it was one of the highlights of my degree, because it enabled us to a diverse group of people coming from diverse denominations, and we spent a week listening to each other. And all of a sudden at the end of the week, not all of a sudden, but gradually over the week, by the end of the week, we realized, boy, we had a lot in common and we really were on the same team. But in recognition of these realities and with an attitude of humility that we'll be able to enter into partnerships that follow Kahane's principles of scenario planning, it is that recognition that will help us, I believe, to not only face some of these challenges that we are facing and overcome them in sparsely populated regions, but I believe that as the church, we can establish a pattern for others to follow. Scenario planning is the heart of Kahane's process, and everyone agrees that we don't like the current situation. That's really the only thing we have to agree on. We don't like the current situation. And so we come together, we develop 3 or 4 potential scenarios that would be better than what we have. And we do this by forming groups, groups with members from each organization. They're very mixed, they're very diverse, they come at things from very different perspectives. And each one develops a scenario of how they believe we could move forward to a better future. And then they come back to the main group with that scenario and they present it. And the entire group says, okay, if we follow that scenario to its logical conclusion, what will happen? And we work through all of those scenarios together. And then together, we determine which scenario or which mix of scenarios is the most appropriate for the challenge we're facing. The real key to the process is the communication and the relationships that are built during that time. I don't have time to tell you a story, but it's an amazing story of a South American rebel and a government official who the government official actually saved the rebel's life after the scenario planning was over because they had developed such a close relationship. Read the book, it's fascinating. Adam Kahane, by the way, was involved in dismantling apartheid in South Africa, and he used this methodology. So coming back to the process that was captured in Cam Harder's book, we need to define the focus of the ministry. What's the purpose of the partnership? What's the end goal, the vision of what we would like to see? We need to discover and appreciate what is, who and what are the available resources? How can we work together to bring all of our resources together? What might it be? What might a truly community church look like? And this came up in our breakout room. What would happen if we took down the denominational label and all worked together and said, this is the X community church? What should be? How will this local body of believers be structured? How will they be discipled to fulfill their purpose in the world? And then deliver, create what will be and turn them loose. Don't hold on. You know, across denominational lines, we have theological and practical differences. But I'm convinced and I've experienced that when we begin to talk, when we truly listen to each other, we discover that there are also a lot of areas of agreement. Speaking as a judicatory, a term that I learned in my seminary process, I'd never heard of it before. I recognize that sometimes we, as judicatories, are the greatest barrier to collaboration between denominations in local settings. But I believe that's changing rapidly. Even events like this are a demonstration of that change. As we think about the sparsely populated regions across Saskatchewan, together, we have a wealth of resources. We have people, we have buildings, we have material things, but there's not a critical mass of any one group in one local setting. And so can we share some resources for the sake of the gospel without concern for the name that's above the door? And that really ultimately is my challenge, is to engage in this stretch collaboration with one another. And I'm just pleased to be able to be here today and would invite anyone to communicate with me as we go forward from here. I've got some more discussion questions. And again, I'm sorry that we're going to have to limit this to probably 7 minutes to get through. And then hopefully we'll have a couple of minutes for questions after. And I'm willing to stay on a little longer if there are more questions. So given our theological and practical differences, how will we work together? Will we be able to find enough common ground to move forward? to choose the most reasonable scenario. And how can we partner together using the denominational resources we have available? So here are the discussion questions. Are there any communities within my sphere that might be a candidate for a collaborative effort with other denominations? Who might I contact to see if there's interest? What local resources are there that could be helpful? And then what's the planning process for that? All right, I'm going to try to share my screen again. And not that I have a lot to, it's not working again. Why is that? There we go. There we are. Not that I have a lot left to share. I did want to say one more thing before I give you the last closing challenge and then open it up for any questions in the last couple of minutes. We are, as a denomination, as a district office, we are in conversations in about 4 or 5 different areas where we're actually working toward this kind of partnership. Those partnerships vary depending on the community. Some of those communities, the Alliance hasn't got a presence, but I'm trying to facilitate the conversation with the local community and with some of the denominations that are there. So just to encourage you that I didn't just write about this, I'm actually trying to put it into practice, and I'm thankful, so thankful for partners such as what we have here in this room and beyond to see that. I just want to close with a 95-year-old challenge from the principal of St. Andrew's College, written in 1927. And I want us to consider what about Lacadina? What about Stranraer? What about Droxford? What about, all of these little communities that hardly even exist anymore, but there are people there. There are people that need to be encouraged. There are people that need to be fed spiritually. And together, I believe, I know that as Susan prayed at the beginning, by the power of the Spirit, together, we can help to bring the gospel and some spiritual care to these folks. So thanks for your time. Appreciate being able to be here, and I'm thankful for each one of you. I would entertain any questions that you might have.
Yeah, and by all means, just put your question in chat and we can rephrase it for you, or you can put your hand up and with your tools and that we can have some opportunity to answer these questions. I have to say, Robin, I'm just thrilled with this presentation. Living in a rural community and watching the stories for some 40 years, you've nailed it, totally nailed it.
Thank you.
So we have a question on the bottom from Brenda Curtis. She is wondering if you are available for consultation. I think that's what I saw.
Yeah, I'm just going to put my email address in the chat. And then if anybody wants to communicate with me, just feel free to do that. As I said at the outset, I am more than happy to share the PowerPoint with you if you would like as well.
Yeah, and if you can get that PowerPoint to Nick, and I think Christine has her hand up.
Okay.
I do. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask, when I was working in rural development, we used to talk about how one of the critical signs of a community's health was, did it have a functioning, the first level we had was a gas station, because often it would have convenience store elements to it as well. The second one was a bank. And I often talked to my colleagues and said, I thought that a church, an operating church, even if it were part of a multi-point charge, was a really critical demonstration or evidence of life and future and potential for a rural town. What did your study sort of, the work you did, what did it demonstrate in that regard?
That's a great question, Christine. I think that institutional presence, I wouldn't say was such a big deal, but many of the characteristics, I would say, of a church that were evidenced would have been. And so when I went to Lacadina, they didn't have a functioning church there. They have nothing. They have nothing there as far as businesses. But what they do have is every year they continue to put on a community fall supper. And every year, at that point, at least, they had that was in the fall, and then in the spring they had a community dinner theater. And so you can see the community connection is still there. And I would say that's the evidence to me, is that community connection.
I think churches so often are a place where that community comes together. Now, it's not my generation, but my parents would speak about the fact of you would go to church on Sunday and see everybody of the community.
Yeah, for sure.
And there's another question in chat, and it's from Linda. And how does the virtual church that we have discovered in this pandemic play into this challenge?
That's another great question, and something that I actually asked in my research before we were driven to Zoom. Before, I guess probably before Zoom was what it is now. There's mixed feelings, and I think that's why it's so critical that you engage with the community that you want to reach into or encourage. The community that I was in said, if we want to watch a preacher on TV, we can do that, but we want someone that we can sit down and talk with, like we're doing here. And I've said, not in my documents, but I've said many times anecdotally, as I've talked to people about my research in that process, in that particular home, if I would have said, look, I'd like to do a pilot project starting next week, would you be willing to open your home to have a small group meet there? They'd have said yes. They were that hungry for spiritual conversation. And it's not so much, as Christine mentioned, the gathering of the church, although the gathering is really, really important, but it's not the gathering of the church to hear the word proclaimed and to go through the word's gone out of my head, the liturgy, pardon me. But it's the engagement with one another about the liturgy. That's what many were hungry for that I talked to in Lacadina and the area there. So yes, the virtual is going to be a great asset. But I think we need to remember that face-to-face, we were built for community.
Go ahead, Nick.
So Robin, you're speaking about collaboration. It just warms my heart. These are the things I love to talk about and encourage. And this project, this stewardship seminar series, is a result of a commitment to this kind of collaboration that's come out of a covenant that's developed between Anglicans, Lutherans, Ukrainian Catholics, and Roman Catholics. But our hope is that this is going to expand considerably to include other traditions as well. And you are going to be on my phone call list. There will definitely be a number of other opportunities of things that we can do together and that we can explore together. So I'm just very happy to hear this discussion.
Thanks, Nicholas. You've been on my list for a while, but I just haven't had the time to make some calls and get some things rolling.
Yes, well, COVID hasn't been helpful, but
No.
we will do that.
Well, it's good to see us collaborating right before our very eyes. So I don't know if there's any more questions this afternoon. And if not, I'd like to thank you, Robin, for just this absolutely engaging presentation. And I think we can all take home a great lot to think about and consider. And I would like to thank everyone who's presented during these webinars, and thank all of you who took part in the series Signs of Life in the Local Church. And I think we've explored the local church very well. And I think it's pretty exciting to see that there are some wonderful signs of life. But And I should mention too that each of the spring 2021 presentations are recorded, and as Nick gets time, edited versions will actually be posted on the screen, or no, on, sorry, I'm reading messages at the same time. This is not good for me. At any rate, they will be on the YouTube channel of the Archdiocese of Regina and the YouTube channel of the Diocese of Qu'Appelle. And so if anyone is wanting to sort of join in these discussions, watching those edited videos will probably be helpful to everyone, and just, you know, give us more people to engage in future webinars, as well as hopefully we get to engage face to face. I think that Robin said that's important, so I'm looking forward to that too. The other thing is that in your email today, there is a survey, and so we need your ideas, we need your feedback. There's a link, I think, on the survey, and that we really appreciate some feedback on that as well. So I don't know if there's anything else I'm supposed to say. If not, it's not on my list. So what can I say? And if not, I think we can move to closing prayer. Cheryl was going to close in prayer, but she had to leave for another meeting. So I'm wondering if Christine, and aren't these chat things amazing? So Christine will lead us out in prayer. Thank you.
Thank you. Good and gracious God, we thank you for the beauty of this earth, both the urban and the rural, the remote and the clustered. We thank you for our opportunity to come together today, your children in faith, seeing that we have more in common than we have apart, that we have more strength together than we have apart, that we have more love together than apart. Bring us into fullness of life in this life as we spread your word, and in the next. We ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen.